I want to start by saying thank you to you all. Thank you for sharing your time with us and with each other this evening in pursuit of supporting the children and young people in your care. I think this is a vitally, vitally important conversation that we need to start and that we need to keep having in various places. My name is Gerard Swan. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the current chair to Quest, which is a lay volunteer-led charity with its origins back in 1973. So a little bit about how we're going to run the event this evening. In preparing for the event, we agreed that we would open up the chat box to allow questions prompted by the conversation this evening. So you can post your questions as you go. These questions will only be visible to the panelists. Unlike the questions that some of you have sent in prior to the event, we may not be able to answer all of these, or we may make the decision that these questions need to be explored, just not today in this particular session. However, we'll keep everything that you share with us, and it'll help us to shape possible future events or some of our future work in support of Catholic educators. And after the event, I'm going to email you, and you'll have an opportunity to feedback to us and tell us what you thought about the event, but also offer other questions if you still have burning issues that you want to raise. So after the opening comments and introductions, I'm going to hand over to George and to Father James, who will have a conversation that will last probably, I'm guessing, around 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. And James Field of the NAHT has agreed to curate and order and pose some of the questions that you raised this evening. George may explore the question once it's asked a little bit further with Father James, and then he'll prompt James Field for further questions. And we're aiming to finish promptly about 8:30. So I'm going to draw things to a close at about 8:25, and we'll offer a couple of closing remarks then. Just to let you know that we're recording the event, but only the panelists are going to be visible in that recording. So you don't have to be concerned about you appearing in the video. That's the way we've set up this webinar. Before I begin, I'd like to say a couple of thank yous. Firstly, I'd like to thank the National Association of Head Teachers, the NAHT, for providing the Zoom platform for this evening's event. I want to thank Natalie Arnott, who is the Senior Equalities Officer of NAHT, for her support in providing the platform. I also want to thank her colleague, Ian Taylor, who's been providing us with the technical support prior to the event and also during the event. So you possibly will see Ian's name on your screen, and Ian's going to orchestrate this evening. In particular, I want to say a huge thank you to James Field, who's the Southeast rep for the NAHT National Executive, whose own exploration of how best to serve the education community led to some conversations with Quest and with Father James Martin. And it's his pursuance of those conversations that's precipitated this event. So we've got a lot to be grateful for with James. I want to say a little bit about Quest. We were formed almost 50 years ago by a London-based group of folk responding to an ad from a young man whose parish priest at the time had told him he couldn't be both gay and Catholic. But that ad, in which he invited folk, gay and Catholic, to meet and explore whether in fact that was possible, drew about 19 people. Over time, Quest has responded to need and embraces our L, B, T and plus siblings of faith. So we're now a national charity with a regionally based network of 5 groups across the country. And we have about 200 members, and we support a further 180 regionally based folk who are participants in the life of our regional groups. And within our groups, we offer community and fellowship. We offer safe spaces for the exploration of faith, orientation and identity. Nationally, we're involved in advocacy work in line with our purpose, Sometimes we work in coalition with other faith-based groups, and we also work with secular LGBT plus organisations when that's appropriate. We run an annual conference exploring issues LGBT plus and Catholic. And when we can, we work with our hierarchical brothers and other diocesan groups in support of the inclusion of LGBT plus people within the structures of our church. Currently in the UK, there are about 7 diocesan-run initiatives which our members support in different ways. But Quest stands a little bit outside the direct authority of the hierarchy, and we maintain what we see as a healthy independence which allows us to minister primarily to the needs of our LGBT plus siblings who still too often find themselves pushed to the margins as they seek to take their place at Christ's table. So it's a privilege for us to be holding this event this evening. It's a subject which is important to Quest. We have been involved with schools for a long time. We get invites to come along and talk about what it means to be LGBT plus and Catholic. But it's also an issue that's particularly dear to my own heart, and for a number of reasons. So firstly, from the age of 21, I was a teacher and left the profession as a head teacher after 20 years. I worked first in primary Catholic education and then moved to special education. It's important for me to tell you that in all of that time, I never felt able to be out, to be the fullness of myself in the spaces that I worked. So back in the day, before we had civil marriage for all, whilst my straight colleagues regularly and without a second thought outed themselves all the time using words like husband or wife, by wearing engagement and wedding rings openly, telling straight affirming stories of the children and family lives they were rightly proud of. My stories used less explicit language, were more veiled as I talked about generic people and generic friends in the most bland and self-protective of ways. Second reason this is important to me is because of these 2 young chaps that I'm going to share with you now. The one on the left is 4, and he knows he's gay, although he doesn't have that word for it yet. He's happy and he's adventurous, but when he was 4, he gets a hint that he is different. And sadly, he also starts to instinctively know that he needs to protect himself from something, from the world outside himself. Of course, it's no surprise to you that these 2 cuties, well, I think they're cute, are me. And at the age of 4, I knew of my difference. I didn't know what I knew. I know language or visual models of people around me to identify with. The difference that I knew of wouldn't become understanding till much later in life. And the world and the adults around me could only offer me a vision of a world in which there weren't people like me, only more people like them. A year later, at the age of 5, I attended the first of 4 different Catholic schools, and for the next 13 years was emotionally and at times physically bullied for my difference in all 4 schools. So when I look at the young lad on the right, I can see the pain and the trauma behind the eyes of the smiling 10-year-old. I suspect the hideous shirt and tie also added to the trauma, but hey, I'll talk to my mum about that later. So it's funny, at the age of 35, when I finally came out to my parents, my dad's response was, "Why didn't you tell me? I'd have helped you fight it." I love my dad, and he sadly has passed now. And I share that not as a judgment, just as a statement of fact. So at the start of this event, I want to pose the following questions and just let them hang in the air. Why is it that we rarely ask children if they are sure when they demonstrate or voice traits of heterosexuality? Do we systemically value heterosexuality less? Or are we making some significant assumptions about it as the prevailing norm? Do we not want the same level of certainty from all of our children that we expect from our LGBT plus siblings? All research shows that people, whatever their age, 4, 10, 21, I'm going to come out now and say I'm 61, but I'm under the old regulations, so I'm already drawing my pension. We perform better at all ages when we are able to be our true selves. And I'm sure you know that. I'm singing to the choir here. We need to do that openly and without fear, in the knowledge that we're safe and that those around us will stand with us and protect us. With so many of you here this evening, I have hope. With nearly 500 people signed up, such an interest in this important subject. I really do have hope that we're journeying together towards that. I have hope that as Catholic educators, you, like I, want to listen and want to explore what truly LGBT plus gospel-led inclusive schools could look like. That you want to create environments where all pupils are safe and can be nurtured and can be their fullest selves as God made them. So again, thank you for giving up your time this evening in the service of the pupils you serve. So I'm nearly finished this introduction, but I'd like to say a little about our two conversationalists this evening. Firstly, I'd like to introduce George White. George is a Quest trustee. He's a transgender and Catholic teacher of religious education at a Catholic secondary school in Leicester. He holds a BA in philosophy and theology from Heathrop College, an MA in global ethics and human values from King's College London, and a secondary PGCE in religious studies from the University of Cambridge. He's particularly interested in LGBT plus inclusion in Catholic schools and works with school leaders, national education unions, Catholic charities, and the Diocese of Nottingham to provide support and training sessions to improve pastoral care for LGBT staff and pupils within Catholic education. Increasingly, he's my go-to person on anything theological. And our guest this evening is Father James Martin. Father Jim is a prolific writer, an author, I believe, over the last 23 years, with, I also believe, 14 authored titles to his name. And I'll just mention a few. The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, a spirituality for real life. Most recently in 2021, Learning to Pray, a guide for everyone, was released. And back in 2017, Building a Bridge, how the Catholic Church and the LGBT community can enter into a relationship of respect, compassion, and sensibility and sensitivity. And that was published to great acclaim and welcomed by many who were grappling with questions about LGBT plus inclusiveness, but struggling with what was often a series of polarized debates in which both sides were looking for a win, rather than respectfully listening whilst walking together on a shared journey, a model, of course, that's becoming more familiar in these synodal times. It's a book I highly recommend. I wanted to add something here about Pope Francis's recognition of Father Jim's work. To do that, I'm going to borrow and paraphrase from an American magazine article by Gerard O'Connell from last June. Francis is well informed of the work Father Martin is doing. He has sought to encourage him in this ministry, and for this reason, in a significant public gesture of encouragement and support, he received him in a private audience in the library of the Vatican's Apostolic Palace on September the 30th, 2019. And later he goes on to say, His letter on the eve of the Outreach 2021 LGBT Catholic Ministry Conference commends Father Martin for all this work, saying, in Pope Francis's words, "I want to thank you for the pastoral zeal and your ability to be close to people with that closeness that Jesus had and which reflects the closeness of God." So on that note, I'm going to hand over to George and to Father Jim. Welcome to both of you this evening. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. George.
Thank you so much.
And Jim.
Thank you, Gerard. It's particularly touching to hear from you, Gerard, you know, that at the time that you were growing up, it was difficult to put these things into words. I had the same, and I must say that when I came out about 5 years ago, that book there, Building a Bridge, was one of the first things that I got to read, which really helped me to kind of cement, you know, the bridge that I needed to build within myself. So it's great to be here with you, Father Jim. I am aware that we've got some guests from all different backgrounds in education, some who are Catholic, some who might not be, some who work in secondary schools, primary schools, higher education, some of whom might encounter LGBT people and know what the Catholic Church says, some who don't. Would you mind sharing with us, Jim, what some of the issues are that LGBT people face in education in particular, but within the wider church?
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you, George, and thank you, Gerard, for that beautiful introduction, and good to be with you, James and Ian, and everyone here. I'm really grateful for all the work that you all do in Catholic education, and it's a real honor to be invited by Quest to address you tonight. George, that's a big question, and there's a lot going on. I think there's a big tension, and the tension is really contained within church teaching, which is we all know that Jesus reached out to those on the margins, especially. He reaches out to a Roman centurion who's not even part of the Jewish community. He reaches out to the woman at the well, a Samaritan woman who's been married 5 times. He reaches out to people like Zacchaeus, the tax collector. He reaches out to people who are sick and poor, and really people who are on the margins. And so the hallmark of Jesus's ministry is really reaching out to those on the margins. As one of my Jesuit confreres likes to say, Greg Boyle, who works with gang members, for Jesus, there's no us and them. There's no us and them. And Catholic teaching in the Catechism, that's the foundation. People always talk about, you know, what is church teaching? The foundation of church teaching is Jesus and the Gospels. It's a person. It's not a book. At the same time, the Catechism asks us to treat LGBT people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. But also, it says that in the Catechism that sexual relations between people of the same sex are impermissible, right? They're intrinsically disordered, and that the church is also against same-sex marriage. So the real tension is between what people focus on. Are they focusing on the exclusionary sort of rules of the church, you know, that really exclude certain things, or are they focused on the kind of inclusionary words that we find in the Gospels? I think more and more, though, what's happening is that people are recognizing that there are so many LGBTQ people in the church, in our schools, right, students, as well as administration and faculty and staff, that the church needs to find a way to include them, welcome them. And I think the final thing I want to say is that one of the objections is that, well, LGBTQ people, their lives aren't fully conforming or reflecting church teaching, but there are many people in our schools, faculty, staff, students, whose lives are not doing that as well. And so the question is, why so much the focus on only the LGBTQ person? So what I try to do in my ministry is encourage people to listen to the experience of LGBTQ people, to welcome them, and really to advocate for them, to advocate for these people who are often at risk. We all know, and I'm speaking to educators, you know the statistics in terms of the suicide rates, homelessness, you know, self-harm. And so we're looking at an at-risk group. The final thing I want to say, by the way, all my answers aren't going to be this long, but you asked a big question. The final thing I want to say is that, you know, we are, as Catholic leaders and as Catholic educators, the schools might be the only place where LGBT kids ever feel welcome in the church. They may hear things from their parishes or even their families, or sometimes even bishops, that make them feel less than, that make them feel unwelcome, that make them feel wrong, right? And for a lot of these kids, the Catholic school for them is the church. And if they can feel a welcome there, that can change not only how they view the church, but how they view God too. Because the fact that they can feel welcome and celebrated and at home and valued, right, and beloved by God, means that they're going to feel more at home in the church. So it's a really important vocation that you all have, particularly for these kids who are really at risk. Anyway, so those are just a few of the tensions.
I thought I started with an easy question, so it's probably only going to get trickier. There's definitely a lot to unpack in there, and a lot of that comes into some of the further questions. So I'll try and keep things a bit more straightforward as we go through. You've mentioned a couple of reasons why it's important that we are making schools inclusive for LGBT students, staff, people that you say might not find that support anywhere else. We hosted a diversity week at my school a couple of months ago. We had in an LGBT Christian priest, Anglican priest, who gave out some pride flags, and the pupils wanted their photos taken with them until they thought their parents might see the photos, because they thought, actually, I don't know what my parents are going to say about this. And that was something that particularly moved me. What other things can people do in schools to promote inclusion and to make school a safe space for LGBT pupils?
That's a great question. I think that what I want to start with and kind of amplify again is interiorly to recognize how much this is. We talked about gospel. I think the first term you used, Gerard, was gospel inspired or gospel based. This is based in the Gospels, that Jesus reaches out to people specifically on the margins. Right. And so one of the first things we can do interiorly as Catholic educators is to really own that, and to really say that this is part of our tradition. Oftentimes it's church teaching says this, church teaching says that, which is so important. But church teaching, again, is at heart a person. So first of all, it's grounding yourself in that. But I would say 3 easy steps. The first thing is to listen. So listen to the experiences of your LGBTQ students. We're focusing on students right now. Where are they? What are the struggles they're going through? George, as you were saying, do they even feel comfortable being, out to their friends and family? So listen, provide a space for them where they can feel safe. You can do small things like even, put up a safe space sticker on your door. Kids really sort of, understand, and they'll sort of be able to tell, in a sense, who is safe to talk to. So first, welcome. Second, befriend. I mean, be their friends as you would be a friend to any student, right? Celebrate with them, accompany them, in their struggles. Part of that is, again, having to do with listening. But I think an especially important thing is to advocate for them, right? To really advocate for them. And what does that mean? That means sometimes advocating for them in the school, sometimes in the diocese, sometimes in the community. And once again, if we think about the school as one of the few places where these kids might feel welcome, it may be one of the few Catholic institutions that actually takes their side, that actually stands with them, which is really important. And this is what Jesus does. He stands with these people, sometimes physically. He's standing with them. So I would say listen, befriend, and advocate are three easy things. But again, to really ground yourself in that recognition as Catholic educators that this is part of the gospel. This is not some sort of add-on, and it's not some sort of faddish or modish thing. This is part of the Gospels. This is who Jesus was. And you're also going to get pushback, as Jesus did. It's not surprising.
Again, a lot to unpack, but I'll stick with that concept of if you get some backlash, and if you find some difficulty, whether you're a classroom teacher, I've seen that a MAT leader just commented, a MAT leader, a bishop, someone that's a director of education, someone that's dealing with safeguarding issues. When you are advocating for young people and you meet difficulty, what would your advice to those educators be?
Well, the first thing is not to be surprised. One of my favorite stories is the story of Zacchaeus in the Gospel of Luke. We all know I can dilate about this story a lot, but basically Zacchaeus, if you think about it, is a man of little stature, right? He's short in stature, like a lot of LGBTQ people. The crowd gets in between him and encountering Jesus in Jericho. You know, we have to sing, sometimes the church is the crowd, or we're the crowd. He climbs a tree. He's invited down by Jesus. And one of my favorite lines in that whole gospel passage is, all who saw this began to grumble, right? All who saw Jesus reaching out to someone in the margins began to grumble. Even Jesus, you know, in Jericho, he's reaching out to this person, and that includes the disciples, they didn't like it, because showing mercy and identifying with someone on the margins always infuriates some people. So the first thing is to remember that this happened to Jesus, and it's not surprising that it would happen to us. So first of all, expect it. Don't be rattled by it. Second, I think always treat people with charity, right? No matter who it is. If it's someone in authority, if it's a parent, if it's a trustee, if whoever, right? Priest, bishop, treat them with charity, right? Listen to what they have to say. Second thing is, I think oftentimes two entrees I think are very helpful. One is reminding people of the fact that these kids are at risk, right? And I think you say, you know, listen, you know, do you know that these kids are at increased risk of suicide, homelessness? You know, talk about some of these statistics, because most people will say, well, I certainly don't want that, right? You know, but they don't know some of these statistics. Also, you can talk about it in terms of kind of helping the families, right? Families with LGBT kids, you know, need help. The other thing I think is helpful are stories. When you're dealing with kind of opposition, and, you know, we see this in Jesus, oftentimes it's not about arguments and debates and philosophical debates or theological debates, as, you know, adept as you might be in that, but stories. Let me tell you the story of a young teenager in my school who attempted suicide. Or let me tell you the story about this kid who feels lost, right? Or who's struggling because his parents hate him. Let me just tell you the story. And I think one of the things that educators, secondary school educators, in a sense, have easier is that these kids are not going against church teaching. They're not sexually active, right? Usually you're talking about younger kids. They're not married. And so you have to say, look, we're talking about kids who are just trying to find their place in society, in their families, and in the church. So stories are very helpful. I find stories, let me tell you about this kid obviously without breaking confidence, let me tell you about this kid that I know. I think they kind of open people's minds up. That's how Jesus taught. Jesus taught in stories, in parables. And I think that can help convert. And then finally, after all these different suggestions, is keep at it. I mean, it's advocacy can be difficult. And even if you help to sort of open up one person's heart or defend one kid, it's worth it.
Great. I certainly think the stories thing works a real treat. I remember when I started my job, I was 1 month on hormones, and I came into the school as Mr. White, and kids were like, are you? Like, you know, I don't trust you exactly. And I didn't really dare speak about it. And the more I've kind of told my story, you know, there are kids who have completely shifted their view, and are now, you know, much more accompanying towards people like myself, which is very touching. So
I want to say, because you become not a category or a stereotype or a theory, but you become Mr. White, you become a person. And I think oftentimes in the church, we have reduced LGBTQ people to stereotypes, categories, and just without really knowing them. I want to say one more thing quickly, that if you think about it, and this might help educators kind of by analogy, there are many people in the Catholic Church, straight married couples, who use birth control. In the United States, something like 80% find no moral problem with using birth control. This is against Catholic teaching, okay? And yet there's not this relentless emphasis on excluding married couples who use birth control or telling them they're not Catholic, and married couples who use birth control don't sort of fret about whether or not they should be in the church or are in the church or are good Catholics. Well, why is that? It's because for the most part, the church knows them. Priests know them, bishops, Catholic lay leaders know them. And they say, these are people with consciences that have looked at church teaching, that have made a decision, and we respect them and we trust them. And so they're welcome. I think the step for the church and LGBTQ people is to come to know them as your students have come to know you, to come to know them, understand them, and see them as people with hearts and people with consciences. So that's part of the value, as you were pointing out, George, of telling stories.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to come back to the suggestion, about other people that perhaps are breaking church teaching, but the church seems to find a place for and doesn't have a problem with. But I wanted to ask how you think the church has changed recently. I became a Catholic 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I went to a Jesuit university, unfortunately learned much more about being a Catholic there. Then I came out as trans. I've been kind of balancing those two things, but I would say even in the last 5 years, things have changed a great deal. So I wondered if you might talk about perhaps some of your experiences with Pope Francis and just some of the changes that are occurring at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I think there are two trends going on. The first trend I can summarize in 2 words, and those 2 words you just said, which are Pope and Francis. And Pope Francis has taken steps, for some people not far enough, but I always remind people, especially when we're talking about the United States or the UK or people in Australia, or largely the West people that are on this call, some things that might seem tepid to us are really strikingly challenging in places like Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. So Pope Francis, he's the first Pope ever to use the word gay. His 5 most famous words are "Who am I to judge?" said about first gay priests and then gay people. He has appointed an openly gay man, Juan Carlos Cruz, his friend, to a papal commission. He sent letters of support, as Gerard said, to me, to Sister Janine Gramick of New Ways Ministry. He called her a valiant woman. To a woman I was just texting with yesterday, Sister Monica Astorga, an Argentine sister who works with transgender people in Argentina. He's talked about Jesus would never say to someone, "Go away, you're a homosexual." He's talked about welcoming kids with different sexual orientations. I mean, in ways that were unthinkable before he took office. I mean, so he's really, in his own way, tried his best to minister to these people, to this community. So that's the first trend. And he has also appointed cardinals, archbishops, and bishops who have been, in general, more LGBTQ friendly. The recently appointed chairman of the Italian Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Zuppi, wrote the introduction to my book in Italian. The recently named Cardinal McElroy in San Diego is a great friend of LGBTQ people. So in these kind of little steps. But the second trend is maybe something that I'm sure you know of, George, is that more and more people are coming out these days. And as more and more people come out and are open about their sexuality and their gender identity, more and more families are changed. And as more and more families are changed, as educators know, more and more schools are changed and parishes are changed. And so that trend, the first trend could end. I mean, we hope Pope Francis lives forever, but the first trend could end tomorrow, right? The second trend is going to continue. And so I think that there's been so many changes. I mean, when I published Building a Bridge in 2017, I was attacked for even using the word LGBTQ. I mean, that people were just all over me for that. Now, the Vatican uses it. The Synod of Bishops just sent out a notice about LGBTQ people. So small things like that. And I see many more, particularly in schools and parishes, outreach groups. Many more, we call them GSAs in the US, Gay Straight Alliances, but outreach groups in parishes and schools. And so there's a lot happening very quickly. Again, not quick enough for some, but too fast for others in other parts of the world.
I'm going to do what any good teacher does and go totally off script now. Just because we're talking about the way that things are shaping up in the future, what impact do you think the Synod will have for LGBT young people? Well,
it reminds me of so I'm a Jesuit, and years ago, our Superior General in the 1960s, Father Pedro Arrupe, was asked by a journalist, and I'm reminded of this when you asked me the question, where is the Society of Jesus going? And Father Arrupe said, I have no idea. He meant that the Holy Spirit is leading it. So we don't know what's going to happen at the Synod. But I will say that certainly by the Synod's own admission, LGBTQ issues are being discussed. And again, this is very different. In Germany, for example, probably the most notable example, they've talked about same-sex blessings, and Cardinal Reinhard Marx has talked about blessing same-sex unions. That's really surprising. But certainly places in the United States and in the West have talked about LGBTQ people and inclusion. And just a few weeks ago, the Synod set out in their communications department, it seems like a small thing, but this is a big thing, sent out a notice saying we want to hear from LGBTQ people. So at the very least, they'll be discussed. They're going to be part of the conversation. But we have to remember it's a big church, and what happens in New York is not happening in Nairobi, right? And what is happening in Leicester is not happening in La Paz, right? So different ways of looking at things. But I think certainly the topic will be discussed, and their voices will be a part of this, which is all to the good. Where it goes, I don't know. But I think just the fact that this is the first time that they're explicitly being told you're welcome to contribute that's a big deal.
Absolutely. One of the things we spoke about in my diocese, and that we are now currently having a look at, is something that you mentioned earlier. So we call them here protected posts, and there are certain roles within a Catholic school where you have to meet the requirements of what is deemed to be a practicing Catholic. Those are for the heads of a religious education faculty, a deputy head teacher or a vice principal, or for a head teacher or a principal. In reality, there are lots of LGBT Catholics already in those roles, some who are out, but many who feel that they can't be. However, it's not necessarily consistently applied across applications throughout the UK. What might you say to someone who's LGBT, whether they're out or not, who considers applying to these roles? What would you say, I think probably more importantly, to the leaders who are appointing in those roles, who might be using that document to justify whether or not to take someone on?
Well, I would simply say that there's no one that you could appoint that is fulfilling all the things that a Catholic should do. I mean, are you appointing people who are divorced? I mean, Jesus is against divorce. Are you appointing people who are divorced or remarried? Are you appointing people who do not go to Mass every Sunday? Are you appointing people who are not forgiving, who don't give to the poor, who don't care for the environment? It's a very strange thing that not only sexual morality becomes, not only does sexual morality become the one litmus test, but only sexual immorality as it applies to one group. And so I think it's very discriminatory. Whenever you have that kind of selective focus on one group, it's discriminatory. That's the first thing. The second thing would be to think of how many people you are excluding and how many gifts you are excluding. I mean, you think about all the people that have helped the Catholic Church in so many different ministries, including education. You think of something like music ministry in parishes, right? I mean, how many LGBTQ people are running music ministries in parishes, right? And how many gifts that you would kind of get rid of. So that's another thing. And then also, how this makes LGBTQ people feel, right? What are you doing to these people and to their friends and to their family? More and more these days, excluding LGBTQ people is not just something that affects them, it affects their families and their friends, and it turns people off to the church, right? This is especially the case, I'm sure educators know this, with young people, right? Young people are very attentive to how people are treated and how LGBTQ people are treated, how people of color are treated, how minorities are treated. And is this really what the church wants to do by focusing so relentlessly on just one group of people and just one aspect of their lives? So I think that the selectivity of focus in the United States, what happens is people are fired. That's usually what happens. They're discovered on Facebook or social media to be gay in some way or in a same-sex marriage, and they're fired. And it's always a scandal. And let me tell you something interesting. What I've noticed in the United States, at least, is when these people are fired, they're always described as the most beloved teacher, the most beloved guidance counselor, the most beloved head of school. And for a long time, I thought, well, that's baloney. That's all PR. But what I realized was one of the reasons that LGBTQ people are so beloved is because they really want to have to stay in the church. They really have to make a choice. And they put up with a lot. And so they're usually really committed. And so I often think of, we talked about the Roman centurion, I often think of that line from Jesus to the Roman centurion, which is a very ironic line because he's out of the community. Never in Israel have I seen faith like this. So I see examples repeatedly of LGBTQ educators, particularly in schools, right, who really have to want to stay, given how they're treated. And so these people are really faithful and devout. And so I think Catholic leaders should recognize that too.
That brings me on a little bit, I think, to your book, Building a Bridge. You mentioned that it's a two-way process, and that, as you say, young people are very much aware of what's going on in the world around them, perhaps in a way that many of us who lived prior to the internet perhaps weren't. I do include myself in that as well. Google came out when I was at primary school, so
I certainly include myself in that.
What would your advice be to young people who feel that they have to give the church a chance? I think you've touched on it a little bit there already, but for young people that come into school every day, they don't necessarily feel that they're being listened to or supported particularly well. What would your advice to them be as individuals, I suppose this would be really?
You mean young LGBTQ people?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, I always say this, the first thing is God loves you. God created you this way. And to enable kids to get in touch with that through retreats or experiences in prayer or reading scripture, all the ways that I'm sure all of you Catholic educators know, it's just as important for the LGBTQ kid. I think even more, because oftentimes they don't feel loved and they hear these, especially online, they hear these hateful messages from people that causes them to wonder. Second, if you're Catholic, you're baptized and you have just as much a role and a part in this church and are just as much a member of the church as the Pope, your local bishop, your pastor, or anyone in school. And so baptism is your membership card in the church. And then second, to be realistic or, real with them and to say, look, the church is still on a journey with this. One of my favorite lines comes from a Jesuit priest named Howard Gray, maybe not known very well in the UK, but in the United States, very well known as a kind of spiritual master. And he used to say to gay kids at Georgetown University, which I really like, I find this hopeful but also honest, God loves you and your church is learning to love you, right? And I think that's both honest and hopeful and real too. But I think I also want to say something else. So Gerard and I all know this book. In the 1960s, there was a book that came out by Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby book, okay? It's like the care and feeding of babies or something. It was a huge bestseller, right? And Gerard and I were probably raised, our parents probably used the book. The very first line of the book to nervous parents was, "You know more than you think you do." And I would say that to educators. Everyone on this call, all 246 people, I've never taught in a high school, right, or a college. You know more than I do, and you know more than you think you do about helping kids. You know more than you think you do about helping them feel that God loves them, right, about reaching out to them. And I would also say this is a little off tangent, but I really want to say this to Catholic educators. Oftentimes in these situations, and in other situations as well, but particularly with LGBTQ people and kids, educators say to themselves, oh, I'm not the right person to talk about this with. I don't know what to say. I'm not an expert in LGBTQ stuff. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a guidance counselor. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a doctor. What do I know? And I think it's important to remember that God has placed you there in front of that child. Not me, not George, not Gerard, not James, not Pope Francis, not any LGBTQ expert or theologian, but you. And so your vocation at that moment is to trust that God has put you there and you're the right person for that kid to talk to and to just speak from your heart. So I think it's not so much knowing kind of the expert advice, where although that's very helpful, but to really trust your own giftedness, and that God has put you there in front of that kid. One more quick thing. There's a statistic that I always like to say to educators, which is if an LGBTQ child has one accepting adult in their life, one accepting adult, that reduces their risk of suicide by 40%. So everyone on this call can be that one accepting adult. And you don't have to have a PhD to do it. I think George might be frozen.
Shall I give, Father James, shall I give you some of the questions we've been
Sure.
given while we're waiting for George to come
Sure.
back? Firstly, there's been a huge amount of thanks for everything you've done and for being here. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone that's sent in a message of thanks. One of the questions is regarding primary, and to just put primary education in context for the UK, it tends to be from age 11 to 4 till 11. So quite a few people have asked, what sort of practical advice can you give educators in terms of helping with LGBT issues in primary education?
Yeah, and George, welcome back.
Sorry, internet.
Sorry,
it's okay.
The spot.
I think the first thing, James, would be to say that I'm not an expert, right, in sort of education of young kids. And I do think that it should be age appropriate, right? And I would say the same kinds of things that you would or would not, you know, teach about sexuality to kids that young, you know, you would use the same guidelines, I would say, for LGBT kids and LGBTQ issues, right? But, you know, I think that there are ways of being welcoming in a subtle way. And one of the most moving, so I would just say that there are ways you can make the kid feel welcome. Certainly if the kid comes to you and says, you know, I have these feelings, to make the kid feel welcome. But I do think it needs to be age appropriate. One of the most helpful things came in a talk I gave to a school a while ago, and I asked the teachers. I said, "What would you say? What have you found helpful?" And one of the teachers said that oftentimes it's kind of the oblique things that are helpful for the kids. So, for example, she knew that one very young girl in her school was the daughter of two women, right? And she said one day in front of the class to this girl, which one of your moms is coming to pick you up today? And that got back to the mother, and the mother said, thank you just for making my child feel welcome. So I think that there are kind of oblique things and subtle things that you can do, you know, without really, you know, going into great detail about things that can help kids feel welcome. So I think age-appropriate things would be helpful. And James, I'm going to turn the question back on you because you're the expert and more of an educator. What would you say to that question to students, to teachers who would ask?
Well, one of the things I really liked about your book, Building a Bridge, is you said the first thing we need to do is to start recognizing, even just using the word gay. And I think you talked about when there was, I think, people in the gay community there was a killing or something, and you said your priest talked about this event but didn't say that it was against gay people.
Yeah.
So for me, I think one of the first things we can do is even just to start to use you know, the words.
Absolutely. And I think that goes for educators and in parishes too, to just acknowledge it and be comfortable with it. But again, you know, age appropriate, right? So, but I think that example of the teacher was perfect. You know, it's very subtle, it's very oblique, but it sends a message to the kids.
Thank you very much, George. I'll let you carry on. I was just putting.
No, that's great. I was just going to mention one of the things that I try and do. I'm a secondary school teacher.
Yeah.
I wear visible signs.
Yeah.
That are just something that's recognizable. So this has got little rainbows on. It's, you know, you can get the comment that this is promoting something, but really for me, it's about indicating that I am someone who is safe to talk to. I've seen a couple of comments come in. I know that you've written some really good stuff on celebrating Pride Month. I saw something yesterday or the day before. Could you explain to the people that are listening why Catholics are able to celebrate Pride Month and how they might go about doing so?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, thanks. It's a really sort of surprisingly controversial topic, and it really shouldn't be. Basically, the response against Pride Month is that pride is a sin, and how can we possibly celebrate sin, right? And that sounds kind of compelling on its face. But I mean, I point out in an article called "Can Catholics Celebrate Pride Month?" It's on we have a new website called outreach.faith, which we started. And by the way, this is a little plug. Our website has tons of resources for secondary school teachers. If you go on the resource page and you hit high schools or colleges and universities or parish life, so many articles and resources and how-to and books, and we hope you find it helpful. But on that page, I posted a thing called "Can Catholics Celebrate Pride Month?" And the thing to remember is, yeah, pride is a sin, right? The kind of pride that says, I'm so wonderful, right? Or look at me. That can morph into vanity. But that's only one way of understanding the word pride. The other way of understanding pride is a sort of a marking of human dignity, okay? It's like saying, I'm proud to be Catholic, right? That's not vain, right? It's, this is a part of me that I recognize as something that is valuable. For most people, for most LGBTQ people, pride is about marking their place in society. It's about defending their simple human dignity, right? Just yesterday in Baltimore on the East Coast of the US, there was a man who set fire to a pride flag, doused the house with gasoline and burned down 3 houses. So part of pride, right, is to say that the LGBTQ community has a right to live safely, right? They have a right not to be discriminated against, right, in terms of employment. They have a right not to be harassed. And so Pride Month is really recognizing their dignity. It's not about vanity, it's about dignity. And I would go further. I would say that given that one of the main reasons that people are sometimes homophobic is because they think they're doing it for supposedly religious reasons. And so it's all the more reason for the church, including the Catholic Church, to stand by these people who are marginalized. Finally, if we look worldwide, now we're talking about mainly students in the UK now, but if we look worldwide, we can see that in 10 countries you can be executed for being gay. You can be executed. So in these countries, it's a life issue. In 70 countries, you can be jailed for being LGBTQ or doing gay activism or anything like that. And in other countries, you can be beaten and harassed, all right? And so the church is called to stand with this group of people who are persecuted and harassed and marginalized. And that's part of Pride Month. And so I think Catholics not only can celebrate Pride Month, but they should celebrate Pride Month. Because again, these are the people on whose side Jesus was, right? Who Jesus took their side. And that's what we're called to do. So I think, you don't have to agree with every single thing that goes on in Pride Month. People send me things like, well, what about this float in this parade? It's like, well, I don't agree with that. But the basic thing is not about vanity, it's about dignity, human dignity. And unfortunately, that is very misunderstood. Just today, in the East Coast in Worcester, Massachusetts, a bishop ordered a school to remove the name Catholic from it and said they could no longer have masses there because they were flying a pride flag. So it shows the great misunderstanding about this and I think real kind of antipathy towards the LGBTQ community. So yes, you can celebrate Pride and you should celebrate Pride.
I think one of the other touching things in your book, within the first couple of pages, it talks about the event that happened in the nightclub, and that there was a lack of response from church leaders, the Orlando nightclub, and that actually one of the things that I've tried to build into my practice is remembering things like that event or Transgender Day of Remembrance, where people have lost their life because of their identity. We should be, if we're talking as pro-life or as... Yes,
and I remind people that in some places, geographic places, but also in some spaces, LGBTQ issues are life issues. These are life and death issues for some people, not only being executed and beaten, but also suicide issues. And so this is a life issue. And so we should be behind this community, who is suffering in this way. And again, especially kids who are really struggling. This is where the church should be.
I had one more question just to get James kind of ready with the fielding of some of the great questions we've having coming in. And I think it's a simple one, but maybe it's not. What are your hopes for the future? What do you hope that this landscape looks like in 5-10 years time?
Yeah, I hope that LGBTQ people are listened to. I hope that they feel welcome in their own church. It's their church too. And I would hope that bishops in particular and Catholic leaders make efforts to include them and to incorporate them. And I think also there's actually 3 things that I think the church can do that are very easy. And none of these things would involve changing any church teaching or really anything. One, I think that the church should support the decriminalization of homosexuality worldwide. That would be a very easy thing for the church to support, decriminalizing being gay. Mm-hmm. Second, I think the church could easily take a stand against conversion therapy, right? Conversion therapy, which really it's psychologically, emotionally, and sometimes physically harmful. And third, I think, again, the church could easily stand up against violence against LGBTQ people. But even that's a stretch, right? And so those things are very easy things to do. And I would love to see the church get behind each of those ideas or projects over the next 5 years.
I think if you take the call of the Catechism seriously, which says to accept LGBT people with sensitivity, compassion, and respect, and stop unjust discrimination, that those are all very much in accordance with church teaching.
You would hope, but it's still a struggle. I worked with a group called the Tyler Clementi Foundation last year, and we came up with a statement against violence against LGBTQ people. That's all it said. Nothing about marriage or anything. Mm-hmm. Just violence against. Out of 300 U.S. bishops, we only had 14 who were willing to sign on. Now, the benefit is we had about 200 religious orders and groups and all sorts of people signing on, but it just shows how difficult it is still. Even it was literally just about violence against LGBTQ people. Some people said, "Oh, it's too controversial." But it's a life issue.
Yeah, one of the things that has come through a couple of times are about bishops and the kind of nuanced relationship we might have in the UK with UK law. That is probably something that's beyond our exploration of this session, I think. But we are going to look at that in the future. So if those are your questions, keep them in mind, but they're probably not going to be answered today. But with relationship with bishops, if you are in, I've had a question about what would you advise someone do who's been refused communion because they're gay and married. I've had a question this morning about someone who's just been outed as gay and is worried about losing their job, or someone that, school leaders are willing to work with these issues, but bishops don't want to touch them. What would your advice to them be? Is there anything that we can do that looks even more, beyond advice in that sense?
Wow, those are so basically dealing with bishops when you're in trouble with bishops or when bishops are responding.
Yeah.
I think the key is always to, is to continue to appeal. To continue to appeal to the bishop, to continue to appeal to the nuncio, to continue to appeal to the Vatican. I also think staying in place is really important, right? I think that I often say to people who are refused communion, now this is just my advice. This is not something that I don't want to tell people what to do in their conscience as their own spiritual life. Yeah. But I always say, go to church and just sit there. Go to church and continue to be a presence in church. It's your church too. Now, I understand how hard that is for some people, but to continue to advocate, in a sense, it's unfair that the very people who are being persecuted have to advocate for themselves. But I often compare it to the civil rights movement in the U.S. And you look at people like Martin Luther King, and John Lewis is one of my heroes, right? That they're beaten and they're persecuted and they're marginalized, and they're also advocating, for the same community. So I think part of it is the kind of grace of being able to stay.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. James, are you ready with a question?
Yes. So what I've done is I've sort of summed up a lot of the questions. One of them we've had quite a few in about is how can we support parents of LGBT students and pupils?
Well, great question. I think one thing online, a resource now everyone can go online. There's a group called Fortunate Families that's very helpful. That is just for that. It's online. They're really wonderful. They're based in Kentucky, where they have a very open bishop. Fortunate Families helps exactly parents with LGBTQ kids and has all sorts of resources and ideas and things like that. You know, I think for families, it's often the shock of the kid coming out, and part of it is accompanying them as well. I don't have any great insights other than to say to accompany them, to help them feel that the kid's going to be safe. That's also another question, to let them know that the kid is loved. But again, I'd ask James and George, what do you say? What would you say to parents? You have more experience than I do in this. And what are the normal concerns that a parent would have?
I suppose with a Catholic school, I think sometimes the issues might be that the parents might have differing views to the children or differing expectations. Yeah,
well, I think. Oh, you mean that they're because of church teaching, or because they say, oh, I wish my kid had been straight? Which would you say?
I think the parents might disagree with the children's way of dealing with things or choices.
Yeah, well, I think in that case, it's accompanying the parent and saying that, you know, I know that this is difficult for you. I know that this is a surprise, but all you have to do is love your child, accompany your child. We will take care of the child. You know, so to know that to let the parents know there's a home for the kids still. But I think basically it's just encouraging them, and also saying that this takes time. You know, something that someone said to me, it's different analogy. When I entered the Jesuits at 27, my parents were not happy. And the novice director said, I've never forgotten this. You've had 27 years to think about this. You're giving them a day. You know, and to say that, you know, the kid may have been thinking about this for, you know, a couple of years, and now you're learning it. So to give them kind of the time that they need to grow into it. But my experience is that most parents eventually come to accept the child and love the child and even become advocates for the child.
Great. And we've had quite a lot of comments, people telling us about varying experiences within their diocese, and some very supportive, you know, some getting LGBT groups underway, others, you know, around the world and in the UK less supportive. Where do you think the push should come in terms of who leads the way in terms of supporting LGBT people? Should it be within the diocese? Should it come from the bishops? You know, should it come from groups like Quest?
Well, I would say, to make a joke, I would say yes to all those things. I think, you know, a good Jesuit model is discernment. There's no one size fits all. And so I think it depends on, I'll just be blunt, it depends on the circumstances of the diocese. You know, in some cases it does make sense for it to come from parents and lay people. In other cases you have very supportive bishops and priests. Some dioceses it's the opposite. I think wherever you can find people to support you, go for that and try to start it out. One of the things I often tell people is that, you know, is do your best in your situation. So your bishop may not be as open, well, and therefore maybe you don't have outreach programs in the parishes or schools. Rather than lamenting that, saying, well, what can I do? You know, George was talking about, you know, wearing the bracelets and providing just a safe space. Even if you have even if you let kids know one-on-one that they're welcome, it may not be what you hope for, and it may not be your goal, but it's still a good step. So I think do your best, discern, right? And then also try to push the envelope a little bit. But to your question, I would say any of those places would be fruitful ways to start. You know, so there's no one size fits all, and don't get down on yourself for not, you know, having everything that you would like immediately.
And just one final comment from me, George, if that's all right. So we've had a lot of comments. A lot of the comments we've had with people's experiences as part of the LGBT community, or their experiences working with children. It's really heartbreaking, some of them. Some of the things people have had to deal with. Really, really sad. I had one person on the comment said that it's exhausting and lonely. And, you know, I've just had a tiny insight into what it must be like, tiny insight, you know, to be an LGBT member of staff. You know, every time I posted something about this on Twitter, some of the vile comments I got, you know, it was dreadful. Have you got any kind of words of encouragement or advice for
I have a lot.
who are exhausted and lonely?
I have a lot, because I get that every day, and death threats and hate mail, and just, I'm sure you've seen, you know, even this talk, you know, got all sorts of opposition. Let me share something with you. It might take a few minutes. There's a couple things that helped me. The most important thing was a retreat I did a couple of years ago. And my retreat director said, kind of out of the blue, I want you to focus on the story of the rejection at Nazareth. And so I was doing what's called an Ignatian contemplation, kind of imagining myself in the scene. And as you remember from the Gospels, Jesus is in his hometown. He gets up to preach in the synagogue. And he basically says, he opens up the book of Isaiah. It basically says in so many words that he is the Messiah. You know, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. Initially, people like him. And then he says, you're going to tell me, do the kinds of things I did at Capernaum, but you have no faith here. And they chased him out of the town. And they led him to the brow of a hill to try to throw him over. What does that mean? They were going to kill him. Now, we Catholics tend to downplay that, but people in Nazareth wanted to kill Jesus, okay? In my meditation, I remember thinking, well, gosh, Nazareth was a small town, 200 to 400 people. He must have known everyone. He must have known everyone in town, certainly everyone in the synagogue. And I remember asking myself and asking Jesus in prayer, how were you able to do this? How were you able to stand up and say these things, knowing that you would get opposition? And the words that came into my head in my prayer, I didn't hear them, but they came into my head, were Jesus saying, must everyone like you? And so part of the invitation is to recognize that not everyone is going to love, like, or approve of you when you do these things, right? This is part of being a Christian. You know, I'm not Jesus, I'm not comparing myself to him, but this is part of the freedom that we're called to embrace as Christians. Not everyone is going to like you, love you, or approve of you, including sometimes your bishop, your pastor, the head of school, parents. That's okay. The second thing is the story of Zacchaeus. All who saw this began to grumble. Why would we be surprised at these kinds of things? All right. So that kind of invitation to freedom from the need for people to approve of us and like us, I think is an essential thing in terms of advocacy. But a couple of other things. We should take courage as Catholics that, you know, just the kinds of things that I was talking about from the Pope. I don't have it here. I used to have the letter here. The kinds of things that the Pope has been saying about encouraging parents, you know, with LGBTQ kids, and encouraging people who minister to LGBTQ kids, and not just me, but all sorts of people. This is the Pope speaking. You know, we should take courage from that, okay? We should know that we're doing the right thing, because when we hear these heartbreaking stories, you know, Jesus is here to help these people, and we're called to follow what Jesus wants us to do. So I think freedom from the need to be liked, a little bit of saying when you see these things, all right, fine, that's kind of part of what Jesus promises us, right? He promises us these things. And knowing that we have the support of people in the church, many people in the church, and knowing you're doing the right thing. So for me, it's a combination of being free. Sometimes I look at these things, truly. I looked at some of the pushback about this talk and I thought, who cares? You know, I mean, it's a lot of homophobia and hatred. So why would I let that in? Right? So part of it is freedom. Part of it is identifying with Jesus. But, you know, really at heart, it's knowing that you're doing the right thing by following the gospel. So, yeah, it can be hard sometimes, and it is. But eventually you realize that this just comes with the territory. All who saw this began to grumble. Think of the Zacchaeus story. It's incredible. Jesus, now imagine, Jesus himself, Jesus is in front of the disciples, calls out to this tax collector. They're mad. So if it happened to Jesus, why would we be surprised?
Thank you, Father. George, do you want to finish off, or Gerard?
I'm gonna swipe back in for two questions, and then we will go back to Gerard. I think we could talk about this forever and a day. We could certainly, you know, keep going, I think, for another couple of hours, but I'll let everyone have their Thursday evening. I've got two questions that have come through in the chat and in some feedback that I've been doing generally since this event has been published. The first one is about language, and it's in relation to relationships and sex education. I think this looks particularly like a question that was guided from a secondary school. How do we, how might we talk about theology of the body, but also use terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and give, and understand those fully? There was a comment or a question that essentially church teaching on sex and relationships and the resources that we are given as educators it diminishes the feelings of LGBT people, and how do we get around that, I think is the kind of question there.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in the theology of the body, but I can say that, look, at this point in human history and in the life of the church, words like gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender should be accepted. I mean, these are simply common words that people have to describe their experiences. A lot of people want to say that we can't even use those words. And yet, one of the analogies that I use is in the United States, we used to use the words Negroes. Now, Negroes say we would prefer to be called Black or African American, so people change, right? And that's part of respect. So when we think about respect, compassion, and sensitivity, respect is using the words that people ask to be used. I also think just today, we published an article by Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane, Australia, who talked about understanding the person not simply based on the act, but in relationship to other people. And I also think that the church, as it meditates, as it always has, on its philosophy and theology, need to come to understand what the most recent science and psychology and biology has to tell us. We simply cannot do theology as if all we knew about theology were, the book of Genesis and Thomas Aquinas. I love the book of Genesis and I love Thomas Aquinas. I do. But that is not the be all and end all of understanding human sexuality. That, it's fides quaerens intellectum. It's faith seeking reason, right? And part of that is looking reasonably at things that are happening in society. So I think that's incumbent upon us as well, to be thoughtful and intelligent Christians and thinkers too.
Great, thank you. And the final question is about supporting trans and non-binary pupils. How might we go about that? Would it be acceptable? I think I've seen you tweet about this, but would it be acceptable? For example, lots of us have our pronouns visible on the screen. Is that an acceptable thing to do in a Catholic context? And how else might we support trans non-binary pupils in their journey?
I wrote an article. I'm just not plugging things. I wrote an immensely long article called "The Church and the Transgender Person," and I think the first thing we need to do, as you would know, George, this is still an area that people need to be educated on. And so I think the first thing we need to do, really before all else, is to listen to the experiences of transgender people. Listen to those experiences. The second thing is that the church should not make any binding policies because, there was just an article in the New York Times yesterday about how to deal with this with young people. And, doctors are still struggling with this. And so to say that we need to put in policies in place, for me, particularly restrictive policies, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I certainly listen to them, accompany them, right? Love them. I'd be interested to know what you think. But I also think, for me, pronouns, I think that's a small thing to do to make someone feel comfortable. And I would say, I know a lot of educators probably know this, but one of the things that I'm not an expert on transgender experience. One of the things that I learned that was kind of surprising to me is how, what do I want to say? How difficult it is when a person asks to be called by a certain pronoun and they're not. I've had many people tell me how hard that is and how difficult it is. But George, what would you say about how we could best accompany transgender people in the church?
I think in my experience, the listening has been a real key part of making that better. This event and other things that I do wouldn't have happened had I not been able to tell my story. I went to a recent training at the Diocese of Westminster, which was actually very, very good. it was on gender identity and legal and pastoral considerations. And there was a priest delivering the message who's the chaplain to the LGBT Catholics in Westminster, who was saying that at the end of the day, you know, we're not the specialist that will prescribe somebody hormones. I'm not the surgeon that might perform surgery on them. I'm not the doctor that will provide the care for them. I'm someone that will pastorally be caring for them whilst they are in my presence. And, you know, at the end of the day, I can do all of those things by respecting what that person is asking of me. And if it's a different name, then so be it. You know, he kind of gave this example of having a stepchild that whilst it's true to say that biologically they're not your child, it is also true to say that they are your child, and that you can have those two kind of sitting together, and that's not problematic for someone who's the educator of, you know, of a trans person, providing them with pastoral support.
Yeah, I think that I think you froze a little bit there. I think, you know, part of it is my belief is that we are where we are today with transgender people where we were with gay people 50 years ago. That it seems odd and it seems confusing and it seems like it shouldn't be happening, but it is, and we have to really listen and learn. There's nothing wrong with the church learning. Before we can be, what do they call a teaching church, the ecclesia docens, we have to be an ecclesia decens, listening church. So I think that's really important. And I think all educators know this, learning from their students. I think George has frozen up again. Oh, there, he's really frozen up.
Gerard, did you want to finish off?
Yeah, I'll come back in here. Wow, I want to keep going. I also want to sit in a coffee shop with you someday,
One day.
and just I could listen for hours, as George said. But we are going to draw to a close now. Thank you to James and George for leading the conversation and the questions. Father Jim, thank you to you for giving up your time. As we said at the beginning, this is such an important topic, and that feeling is clearly indicated in the chat box. Huge appreciation from lots and lots of folk. There's also a desire to want to extend this conversation and in different directions. So we've had a limited amount of time this evening, but we will use what we've learned, what we've heard, what you've told us, to look at where we take this conversation next, where we take this journey next. I want to thank again the NAHT for their support in hosting this event, to Ian for his expertise this evening, and for stopping my screen share that I forgot to take off. Apologies for that. Thanks to Ian. Just to briefly say to you all, what we will do is we will use the information that you have used to register once and only once to email you with information about where we go next with this, to ask you for feedback, to tell you about how you can sign up for updates. So we will only use that information once, and then we will delete it. And so if you do want to stay up to date with things, if you want to find out how you can get hold of the recording, how you can share that with people that you wish were here, you do need to sign up for the updates.
And can I say a few things before we end?
Absolutely.
Just a few things. First of all, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone at Quest, Gerard, and George, and James, and everyone else, and Ian. I do want to say that there is a lot of information on our outreach.faith website for educators, a lot. And so I think you'll find good resources there. Yeah. And I'd ask you to keep me in your prayers. And maybe before you're done, Gerard, can we end with a prayer? Is that okay?
Absolutely. If I can just say one
Sure.
or two things before we do. So the links that have been mentioned by Father Jim, I will include those in the email. And you have our email address if you want further information, the Catholic Educators at Quest LGBTI. If any of you want to engage in one-on-one conversations, we're happy to do that, but we are limited in capacity. So you'll need to bear with us. We've got a lot on and only a few of us, so bear with us, but we will respond. Father Jim.
So let's just take a moment and pray in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Let's just take a moment and remember one thing that you heard today in this presentation, a question, an insight that really helped you and that really stuck with you. Let's just take a moment and call to mind that one thing that you heard. Loving God, we thank you so much for calling us as educators, this beautiful vocation as a teacher, just like Jesus was. As we open our hearts more and more to those on the margins, those in our world and our school that might feel left out or excluded or ignored, give us a spirit of love as you gave Jesus. Help us always to be loving and merciful and inclusive. Help us to treat them with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, with closeness and tenderness. Help us always to have loving hearts. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Have a great evening. Thanks for giving up your time. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
God bless.